New York poet C Popa discusses poetry, medicine, and the poem which won her the £5,000 Open 2015 Hippocrates Prize for Poetry and Medicine. Maya, you've studied poetry both in the US and in the UK.
Through Oxford and being from New York, I was particularly fascinated and interested to read British poets and to bring those poets back to the States.
How did you become interested in the Hippocrates Prize for Poetry and Medicine?
I began working at Poets and Writers magazine, which is sort of the hub that compiles all of the prizes, awards, and all the information for emerging writers and for established writers in the US. And so at some point I said, I'd be interested in writing a piece on competitions in the UK and the prizes that Americans may or may not be applying to, and sort of cross-pollinating further the influences between American writers and British writers, because there are so many historically and occasionally contemporary. We forget that there are amazing poets here, and vice versa. I did some research, and this prize stood out immediately as a tremendous initiative with, of course, a long history of fantastic winners and, of course, a very lucrative prize for poetry. So I really wanted to write something about this and just make sure my friends knew about it and make sure other American poets knew that this was available. And I also think there's nothing better sometimes than a well-timed competition to have you work a little harder on a poem you may be contemplating, because it gives you some kind of a deadline. And of course, as a poet, you have to be, or as a writer in general, you have to be very self-motivated and disciplined about finding time, especially if it's not your primary career, but it's that much easier when you know there's a competition and there are judges who are there to read it.
So had you been interested in poetry and medicine as a theme before this?
I had, and I'd had this poem in mind for, I would say, 2 years prior to writing it. My father's side of the family are all doctors and all also writers for some reason, so there's a real marriage of humanities and medicine. And I think I'm just a hypochondriac, which is my, a tribute, my idiosyncratic tribute to medicine. But there is something about medicine that's always fascinated me, and about biology and the sciences in general. I think it was rather a natural poem to write, but of course the poem itself dealt with the history of my family, and that was something I had to think about further, and then think about neuro-morphology, which is a topic I didn't know that much about. So I actually ended up finding his papers from Cambridge, brain on the hypothalamus of some kind of particular rat, and in so doing, it was extremely stimulating seeing all of the vernacular really that I was unfamiliar with. So the marvels of the internet, I started looking up and researching these terms that I didn't know and learning more and more about the brain and the process, and each layer sort of bloomed into another and invited another image and another idea. And of course most of the writing for poets is in the revising, right, in the revision, because it's about compression and getting to the marrow of it. So I learned a lot writing this poem and negotiating the historical narrative, the personal, and really the brain science that was.
And did you know the whole story before this, or did you end up finding out more about it in the course of wanting to write this?
I knew the story, and it was really interesting because there were parts I felt, this part will go in the poem. This is such a fantastic image. For instance, some of the students formed a human chain outside the school, and then I thought of chains of DNA, and I thought of all these images. I thought this will have to go, and then writing it into the poem, it just didn't work. It felt perhaps a little too sentimental in the moment and in that poem. So it was really marvelous to work with, again, the scientific material, which I didn't. Again, the parietal lobe was the term I learned writing this poem, because this is what he'd worked on, and I had to understand what that meant. And then, of course, the metaphors and analogies that come out through that are also interesting. But in revising, again, that image that I thought for sure would be in the poem didn't have the same effect as someone forgetting the combination to an ether closet, or something a little more subtle, or less evident, I suppose, less evident a protest than that. So I knew the story, and it has many other interesting layers. Again, he did escape, and he did die of something he could easily have treated. And of course, that he himself knew very intimately. He knew what he was suffering from, but he could go to a hospital because he would have been arrested for being first anti-fascist and then anti-communist, and very vocally so.
The Hippocrates Prize now has a young poets category.
Yes.
It hasn't been running for 3 years now.
Yes.
We had a wonderful winner from New Jersey this year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's aimed at 14 to 18-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
In your own case, how did you become interested? At what age did you become interested in poetry?
I became interested in poetry very early. I would say from the ages of, from 5 and 6 on, I was already writing poems. And I was educated in a French school for the first 9 years of my life, so all of my coursework was in French, even though I was in New York and I spoke Romanian at home. And I think part of the appeal of poetry was that there was this malleability you could have. I understood, I think, from an early age that a word in Romanian has a different nuance than it does in English, has a different nuance than it does in French, and I think it felt very playful and also very generative to be able to stack sort of the words in interesting combinations. And then as I grew up and when I eventually went to an American school for high school and was introduced to English and American poets and fell in love, and it played the same role. I mean, I wrote some cathartic-like verse that is for my eyes only and does not achieve very much, but felt, again, cathartic and exciting. And what I'm interested in still is sort of the combination, the texture of language. And one of my favorite poets is John Manley Hopkins, who of course has this very sort of kinesthetic relationship to language and wrote a lot about the body and about medicine. I think encouraging that age group is vital, and that's actually the age group I teach. So I'm very committed to it. I think the more, and I tell my students this all the time, the more they can think of themselves as real writers, the better. And one way to do that is to indoctrinate yourself into the world of competitions and giving yourself new challenges, and that's what you'll have to do as a professional, quote-unquote, writer, as an older writer. No one lays opportunities out for you. You have to seek them. You have to apply at every stage of your career as a writer. So I think the earlier they can get a taste of that, the better. So this is certainly something all of my students will know about next year, and they'll all be applying for the young category.
And for those who write poetry but hadn't thought about medicine as a theme, what are your thoughts on that?
I think medicine and poetry have very obvious sort of complementary goals. They're both trying to articulate the ineffable. They're both trying to articulate something that's beneath the surface. And in a way, they're also both baffled by language, right? Words sort of escape. When you get a diagnosis, you sort of know what that means on some level, and then on some other level, on some other cognitive level, many things are happening. And a poem's the same in some ways. It can't capture the exact feeling. It attempts to, and sometimes abstractly, and sometimes, again, through language, through sound, through all of the marvelous combination of form and content that poetry provides that perhaps prose cannot. There's a clear complement there. I love to do research on very obscure things. I mean, the moment I find something I don't know about, I look it up. And I think that impulse, particularly, I found when writing this poem about medicine, there are such elegant principles in medicine. I mean, the way the blood works is fascinating, and truly, and it can sound a little disingenuous to say poetic, because the work that medics do, that doctors do, is not poetry, right? It is very real and practical, but it does have a poetic element. I think we should be able to say that without fear that we'll be perceived as superficial or pretentious. I think often things that are complicated are, it's like, oh, it's poetic because someone along the way in history said poems are complicated and difficult, so anything difficult has to be poetry. That's not true. There is something, I think, about medicine that is poetic, and it all comes back to the body and the human life, what poems are trying very hard to capture, and that's what medicine tries to understand as well.
So, Maya Popa, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Entries for the 2016 Hippocrates Prize are now open. See more on our website, hippocrates-poetry.org.